think we can go ahead and get started here. I don't want to keep everyone waiting. I'm sure we'll have more people sign on. But so everyone knows, this webinar is being recorded and will be shared. So if you have someone that wasn't able to make it, we'll make this available. I'll be sending it out probably later today or tomorrow morning. And this is part of a series of webinars. It's our career exploration series. AFS-USA volunteers, young alumni, and other audiences are welcome to join the series. We have one more, which will be July 13th, and I'll make sure to send out that invitation. But my name is Julie Ball. I'm the Field Marketing and Operations Specialist at AFS, and I'll be introducing both our moderator, who will be introducing our guest speaker today. Before we get started, I wanted to make sure everyone knew that this is a webinar format, so you'll be able to see our panelists, but any questions you can put in the chat box or the Q&A box, and we'll try to address those as possible. Before we get started here, there we go. I just want to let everyone know, if you're not familiar with AFS-USA, we shared this out on social media, so we might have some audience members who are not as familiar with our mission, but we honor the legacy of our founders, volunteer World War I and II ambulance drivers who emerged from these wars with the mission to help prevent future conflict through cultural exchange and understanding. We are a partner in a global network, and we offer international exchange and education opportunities in over 45 countries, and we host, you know, in normal times, students from over 90 countries. So true to the spirit of our founders, these programs are made possible through AFS volunteers. I know many of whom are joining us today. And there are more than 4,000 volunteers in the US alone and over 50,000 worldwide. So quite a considerable global network there. This career series is actually as an initiative as part of our AFS-USA Young Ambassadors program. And that's our Young Ambassadors program is a way to engage alumni who are 40 years old and under, giving them an opportunity to stay engaged and continue their AFS journey for the benefit of both themselves and the larger AFS community and others. So if you want to learn more about that, you can visit our website or email us at alumni@afsusa.org. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Jill Warner. She is an AFS volunteer and staff member. So as a volunteer, Jill led student groups on AFS programs to Panama, Ireland. She's worked with study abroad programs and scholarships for students in her area. She's a former Spanish teacher and school administrator and has also served at the Indiana Department of Education as the Global Learning and World Languages Specialist. Jill is and has been a part of the board of directors for ACTFL, CSC, TFL, IFLTA, Partners of the Americas and Global Indiana, and probably more acronyms, all which advocate for language learning, ICL, intercultural learning, and global experiences. At AFS-USA, Jill provides materials and lesson ideas to educators and guides volunteers to connect and build relationships with their local schools, and we all know so much more. So thank you, Jill, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks so much, Julie. Julie is going to pop up a poll on everyone's screen so that we can make sure we know who is joining us today. So hopefully that has popped up for you. You are allowed to click more than one thing. So if you fit in more than one category, you may be a language teacher, a non-language teacher, you could be an AFS alum and or volunteer. If we don't have your category listed, feel free to drop that in the chat box. But we're just trying to make sure that we, in our chat today, we address all of the needs and potentially the questions of all who chose to join us and give us some of their time today throughout their summer. So it looks like we've got most folks who have submitted their vote there. So we'll see who's on the call with us. And we've got at least half of our folks that are here on the call with us. You should be able to see these results. At least half of you are related to AFS in some way, shape, or form as a volunteer and or as an alum. And we've got quite a few educators that are on the call as well. So feel free to use the chat box and share with us who you are, where you're from throughout the country. It's always fun to see where folks are joining us from throughout the United States. And I'm sure as I get ready to introduce our kind of decorated speaker, our host today, I want to make sure that, you know, as the 2020 Language Teacher of the Year for the United States, it's great, I think, that she can see where everyone is joining us from which states and so on throughout the country. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our host, Rebecca Blouwolff. As I mentioned before, she is the current year, the 2020 ACTFL. ACTFL is the American Council on the Teaching of Foreign Languages. It is the organization where language teachers connect. And she's serving this year as the National Language Teacher of the Year. If anyone on our webinar today had the great fortune of being able to see her give her acceptance speech at the ACTFL convention in 2019 in November, you would have been blown away by her passion and her advocacy for languages as a means to provide a lot for students and for our country and our culture. Rebecca can also be found as a blogger. She's on social media and has been a frequent guest on podcasts such as The Cult of Pedagogy, We Teach Languages, and Inspired Proficiency. You'll learn a bit more about her throughout her chat today, but she has been able to spend her summers abroad with French families and has been a Fulbright scholar as an English assistant teacher, and was a recipient of a Dorot fellowship in Israel and also in Strasbourg, France, as a teacher of English as a foreign language. She's passionate about language and culture, and I don't think you'll leave this webinar today thinking anything other than that. She is very much a lovely individual. She's been great to get to know and just learn more about her. And I think her passion will be very obvious as that comes across in the things that she's going to share with us today. So without any further delay, I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca and allow her to introduce herself, because she is so much more than the 2020 National Language Teacher of the Year. But it is nice to see her in her educational space on the cover of the Language Educator magazine, which is one of the publications through ACTFL. So Rebecca, we're going to turn it over to you, and then we'll get started with some questions. And for our audience members, if you do have questions that you'd love to have us ask Rebecca throughout our chat today, there will be plenty of time that we've reserved for your questions. So feel free to drop those in the chat box, or please put those in the question and answer section, and we will slot those in as they are appropriate throughout the chat.
Great. Thank you so much, Jill. I'm really excited to be here with all of you. It's a kind of cold, gray day in Boston, so this is a fun opportunity to do something that brings sunshine to my heart, which is talking about the importance of language learning in the United States and sort of the way that, in my opinion, languages can really help us begin to heal some of the rifts that exist in today's world. So first and foremost, I am a middle school French teacher. I have taught in the same school outside of Boston since 1998. And I just think middle schoolers are the best people you could choose to spend your work days with. So I really enjoy their energy and their silliness and their sort of unfolding process of discovering who they are. But I never planned to become a language teacher. I was not a French major in college. I really came to this work through a sort of unconventional path. And I thought I would just give you a little taste of that. Since so many of you are alumni of AFS and volunteers, I'm hoping this might connect with some of your current interests and maybe even a future career path choice. So let's see, if we go to the next slide, I would just say that I was born to hippies in the early 70s who really loved to travel, and that was a big family priority. So this is my parents, maybe the year after they got married in Paris. And although they are people who love to travel, they are both monolingual. And the story in our home around language learning was how both of them had been total failures, and my mother could never pass college German, and everything my father said in Paris got him the opposite of what he wanted, or people made fun of him. So I was raised really in a monolingual home with a sort of phobia around language learning. That said, let's see if we go to the next slide. When I was in elementary school, I grew up in a very small town of fewer than 2,000 people. And one of my classmates in 4th grade, her mom actually had quite a bit of background in French and had taught French earlier in her life. And she invited students from there was one 4th grade at my school, there were 20 of us, and she invited whoever wanted to come over on the bus after school on Wednesdays, starting in 4th grade once a week, to learn some French from her. And in our 2nd year of after school classes with Portia, we rented a VW bus and drove up to Quebec City. So that's a picture of all of us in front of the welcome sign. I am second from the right next to my dad. And that trip was a source of great excitement for me. And I'm sure for those of you who remember your first time abroad, the language was everywhere. You could buy magazines. We were making all sorts of mistakes at restaurants with hilarious results. We slept in bunk beds in a hostel. Everything about the trip was fascinating. And that kind of catapulted me into advanced French when I entered the regional junior high school that I attended. And so at that junior high, I had a French pen pal in outside of Montpellier, France, in the south. And we were writing to each other. And then in one of her letters, she said, you know, would you like to come visit? And so if you advance to the next slide, you'll see a picture of me with Elise. And that was already our 4th summer that we had spent together. And those summer homestays, first of all, you know, my French got so much better. I was very comfortable speaking and listening as a result, even though when I had gotten there initially, I couldn't function at all in the language and was terribly, terribly confused. But it also really gave me this sort of anthropological, lens into life abroad and trying to understand that the choices people were making were not familiar to me, but made sense within the context of their own culture. So I arrived at college thinking I would be a French major. I had spent these 4 summers abroad, really knew the language. And then it turned out that every time I went to the library with my French novels, I would just fall asleep on them. The literature did not speak to me at that point. I was much more interested in spending time with people, which was not part of being a college French major. And so I ended up studying other things in college. And then having the opportunity, actually I served as a TA for the French department at my university. So that was one way to stay connected to the language. And then after college, I did apply and received this Fulbright teaching grant. And so let's see, if you go to the next slide, you will see me looking a bit younger, sitting in the school library of the collège, where I was assigned in rural northern France to be an English teaching assistant for a year. And I adored that year. I got to travel a lot. I lived in a high school with women from other countries who were there to teach their languages. But the whole time, I never considered that I would ever become a teacher. I really just enjoyed the experience of seeing a different culture, having access to so many people. It was a small enough town that being an American was a really big deal. And people would stop me on the street and say, oh, are you the American? What's it like in the States? And so I sort of started to get a sense of what it is to carry the responsibility of conveying your entire nation to strangers. And when I came back from that year in France, I was staying with my parents in my childhood bedroom and applying for social studies teaching jobs, because that was really more my academic background. And I was getting a couple interviews, but I hadn't gotten a job. And so I finally decided to apply for a single French teaching internship. And I was hired immediately. I was out of my parents' house within a week, able to buy my first car. And I was an intern at an independent school in Massachusetts. And that's where I discovered that I actually really did like teaching. It wasn't just the aspect of being abroad that made it so fun, but it was really working with the language with young students that brought that interest to me. And after a year there, I was looking for a more urban environment. And so I did come to Boston, and that's where I joined the middle school where I still teach today in Wellesley, Massachusetts. but that desire to travel and spend time abroad has stayed with me throughout. And so after a couple years at that middle school, if you go to the next slide, I did have this opportunity to live in Jerusalem for a year. And it was in 2001, which was the beginning of the Second Intifada. So it was a very tough time in a way to be in Israel. I had not lived in a culture where you had to get up and listen to the news or read it first thing before you went out because you just didn't know what you were walking into. And it was also a chance for me to be a language learner again. I spent a lot of that year learning Hebrew. And I was just saying to Jill and Julie when we got on the call that this summer is actually the first time I've been able to get back to learning Hebrew. So I'm doing online study with that this summer. So from there, I came back to Boston, taught for a couple more years, and then I met the man who is now my husband through a Hebrew language book club that I was running. And he was finishing up his PhD, and we ended up deciding to get married and then move to Strasbourg, France, on the German border, where he completed his postdoc. So if you go to the next slide, you will see us young and unencumbered, living in France. And I taught English again through a French government program that year, and also took a lot of classes at the university. So that's sort of the bulk of my travel in terms of years abroad and how I got started with the French, becoming a French teacher. And again, just a very circuitous path that involved some trial and error. I think looking back on it, you can make it into a story, but at the time I would have told you, I have no idea what I'm doing with my future. I'm just doing one thing that I like and then another thing.
So thank you for sharing with us that kind of perspective and story and kind of that circular piece of how your travels have kind of morphed to help you be where you are today. It sounds like a lot like our other featured speakers that we've had in this series, that you were kind of bitten by what we would call the travel bug very early in life, almost a gift that was given to you by your parents. And what role would you say that these early travel experiences had on your outlook for the future, your outlook on life, and just kind of how you chose to view things from then on out?
Sure. When I think back to that first summer in France, I had never lived with any other family, not the family down the street, not another family in the United States. And so just that aspect of being in a homestay situation for a month with perfect strangers where you're expected to function as a family member was a real eye-opener for me. And I think middle schoolers are sort of inherently egotistical and self-centered because they haven't usually seen much of the world yet. And that's very much who I was when I arrived. And I remember coming down for breakfast the very first morning in France, and I was still in my pajamas because that's how we rolled in my family. And my host mother said to me, go upstairs and get dressed, and then you can have breakfast, but you don't walk around in your pajamas in our house. And I was just shocked. I was actually really mad. I thought that was so rude that she expected me to get dressed before I could have breakfast. And basically every day was just a series of me falling on my face, making a mistake, getting mad or frustrated or confused, and then trying to figure out what I was supposed to be doing, which was inevitably not what I was used to doing in my day-to-day life back home. And so I think that not only did I learn a lot about French culture through going through those experiences, but all of a sudden I sort of understood my place in the world much better. And I realized that my parents had made certain choices and that we lived in a particular cultural situation that before had just seemed normal, that was the way things were. And so for me, that was a real awakening about understanding difference, and then slowly being able to understand difference with less judgment, and even with a positive feeling that there were things that family did that I actually really liked that were not part of my family's culture. And so I think that sort of anthropological lens, as I was trying to understand why in this family, I remember we went on vacation and the host father at one point came into the kitchen and asked me where the water glasses were. And I was so shocked that he didn't know, and that I did know, like this was not a man who entered the kitchen in this family. And that has stuck with me for 30 years. I have not forgotten that. And just, sort of all these things about how people were operating, their worldview, their cultural perspectives, having to debate American politics as someone who had not really seen herself as part of the American mainstream until then. And then people wanted to know, what did I think of the president? And why did I think this was good? And why was my country always doing this or that? And so I think it really just it was very humbling and humiliating sometimes. We had a trip to Paris where I really needed to go to the bathroom. And I opened up the door to the bathroom in a bar in Paris, and I didn't see a toilet. So I walked out, and then I kind of hedged my bets, and I said to my host sisters, oh, you go ahead, figuring they would open the door and say, oh yeah, that's not a toilet. We don't know what's going on. And they just went in, and they were in there for a couple of minutes, and then they came out. And I realized, okay, you're 15 and you can't even find a toilet in the bathroom, right? So, just sort of realizing how limited my perspective was, I think is something that we can carry with us anywhere in the world, because now if I'm in a work situation that's challenging or a political situation that's challenging, I'm able to see that I'm coming from everything with my own perspective, and that I might be interacting with someone who's coming from a totally different worldview.
And I think much like a lot of our returnees and anyone who's been part of the AFS network has probably had some similar entertaining situations that we can all look back and just kind of have a chuckle and, laugh at kind of what we went through, and then process and really reflect on what did we learn from that experience? What can we take away from that? So when we start thinking about, some of your takeaways, you mentioned that your initial goal when you went to the university and through your, experiences and homestays abroad in France, that you initially did not necessarily want to be a teacher, and certainly not necessarily a French teacher. So what changed your mind? And, once you've gotten into that profession, you've pretty much stuck with it and clearly have learned to master your trade. So what really kind of turned on that light or ignited that true passion for you as a language educator to lead you to where you are today?
So in the summers of college, I had a variety of different desk jobs where many of them were linked to language experiences. So I was an intern at the National Yiddish Book Center, where I was cataloging books all day. And I worked at the Library of Congress in the Judaic section, where I was studying these Hebrew books and cataloging them. And 2 summers, I worked at a kind of fancy summer camp that was on a college campus as an administrator. And I was so sleepy at all of those jobs, sitting at my desk, surrounded by papers. I just wanted to take a nap all the time. And I thought, how am I going to function as an adult if I can't even stay awake at the job? And I also, to be honest, was not a very good employee. So especially the camp job, I kept getting feedback from my boss that I needed to answer the phone with more enthusiasm, and I needed to be quicker to take her orders and turn them into whatever I was supposed to be doing. And I think that just my personality was not a great match for being managed, particularly in my early 20s. And so I began to look at teaching as one of the few opportunities I could find where I would be my own boss from day one. I would be in the classroom with the kids, and I would just have to figure out what I was going to do, and it was going to be pretty much all on me. And so that was really the appeal, is that I would be not sitting, and I would be in charge. And my personality kind of lends itself to wanting to be in charge, so that was a good match. And I was much more awake if I was on my feet in this sort of performative role every day. That I found that very motivating, very awakening. And so, looking back, there were plenty of hints along the way that this is where things were going to go. When I was in college, I was a volunteer in the Providence, Rhode Island public school system, and I did literacy tutoring there with the same kid for 4 years. I had a work-study job as a TA in a GED high school equivalency program for low-income moms. So I would walk downtown and help them with their GED lessons a couple times a week. And that helped me pay part of my college expenses. I mentioned earlier that I served as a TA for the French department once I had run out of language courses and there was only literature left, and I had realized that the literature thing wasn't going to work for me. So I'd sort of had all these teaching experiences, but somehow, it just did not occur to me that that was the professional direction I was going to take. But personality-wise, the teaching thing really suited my passions and strengths.
I can relate to that very much. I had a similar story in not starting out to be a language educator myself. So I completely relate. Also had pen pals and early abroad experiences as well. So thinking about, your passion for students and now that you've really engaged and, you love your students and you love the job that you do, what do you take away from your experiences that you always prioritize or make sure that you impart to your students about your language experiences, your cultural experiences, so that, you know, in some way that might inspire or ignite a similar passion in them as it did with you?
Sure. So first off, I do take very seriously the idea that I am a French teacher and my goal is to turn out students who can function in the language. And I still remember landing in France. I was 14 years old, sitting in the back seat of my host family's car, and the host mother was asking me some question over and over again, more and more loudly, and I had no idea what she was asking me. And that was after 3 years of immersion style instruction in a pretty good public school system. And so to me, that just really speaks to the importance of using the language in the classroom and of giving our students every opportunity they possibly can have to interact with the language. I think so often when I tell people my job, they respond to me by saying, oh, I took French, but it was terrible. And I never really learned to speak it. And my teacher was crazy. And you know, we have so many negative narratives around language teaching in the United States. And so, you know, I really feel first and foremost, we have to be turning out kids who can use the language. Whether or not they can tell you about all the complicated grammar and the literature, not as important to me. So there's the language piece for sure. And then there's this whole other piece, which is very much why I find language interesting, is for me, it's a tool in order to dig deep into culture and build friendship. And so for me, the biggest lessons in my time abroad, and this is not going to surprise anyone who's been listening, is really the idea of humility and curiosity. And I just can't say enough about how I feel both of those characteristics are lacking in our leadership in the United States, and that promotes a sort of arrogance and lack of curiosity that only costs us and our relationships with other people in the world. And so I do see my classroom as this sort of microcosm of kids beginning to question the idea of, why is that normal? What do you mean normal? Is that the way your family does it? Is that the way your family does it? And trying to get the kids to be curious and less judgmental about cultural difference. And that can apply to how they interact with the kids sitting next to them in the class, the family living in the apartment above or below them, and then, you know, hopefully someday also interacting with people who are coming from different countries around the world. So I love sharing stories with my students about different faux pas that I have made over the time, you know, over the years in my interactions with French people. And I think it's good for the kids to see teachers modeling the fact that even though I've been studying this language for 35 years, there are still times that I will make a mistake, and that is a reminder to me that I am still learning, and that that's an opportunity for me in this world. And so when I think about the evolution that I'm looking for in my students, it's from, if I present something new from a French-speaking culture, you know, they're seeing poutine for the first time, or they're seeing a family in Senegal share a common plate and eating with their hands, that maybe their initial reaction is, ew, and then they can go from that ew to, oh, and then maybe even eventually, ooh. And so I think that's, you know, that's a developmental journey. It really depends on the maturity of the students. I teach this year at least 6th grade and 8th grade. And for even just for the kids to get the sense that, oh, that ew is something that is maybe problematic and maybe I want to work on that, to me is the big lesson. And I think if we could, you know, zoom out on that to a meta level, we'd be in a lot less trouble right now in this world.
Yep, I can't agree with you more. In fact, I think a lot of our folks who have had a connection with AFS would probably resonate very much with that last piece that you talked about moving from the ew to the oh to the oh. And because we very commonly have, you know, an expression, you hear volunteers use it all the time, that say, you know, it's not, it just because something is new doesn't mean it's good, it doesn't mean it's bad, it's different. And so it's, you know, why is it different, you know, why do people do that? And really trying to get to a lot of those under the surface cultural elements that are part of, you know, that group of people or that part of the world that they're learning about at the time. And so I will say that middle school students, having had a similar experience in the classroom, they are, their expressions tend to be exaggerated at times, so that ew or that oh can be much bigger than what you may get from students at different levels. So just to shift gears a little bit, one of the things we mentioned when we, had your bio up there and we're kind of introducing you was the idea that you are a language advocate. And I think the term advocate may mean different things to different people. And so, especially looking at, ACTFL and your role as the National Teacher of the Year, what does it mean to be a language advocate? I mean, we'll start with there. I have some follow-up questions to go with that, but what does it mean to you to be a language advocate? Because a lot of the listeners on this webinar are either language teachers themselves, or they've had an experience with a language or culture abroad, having been an AFS returnee or working with participants who are learning languages while they're here or abroad. So what does that language advocate term kind of mean, or how does that resonate with you?
So this is definitely an identity that I feel I'm growing into, and I didn't necessarily identify myself as a language advocate, even though there were, again, many signals pointing in that direction until recently. So if you want to go to the next slide, I think I would start with saying that to me, it begins very close to home, and the decision that my husband and I made to raise our children in non-native French since birth. And so this is a picture of me with my kids, obviously in front of the Eiffel Tower many years ago. Every summer we travel to France or Quebec, and we either vacation with a French-speaking family, or we put the kids in a camp where they're going to be exclusively with kids from that culture. And so I really felt like it was an important family project for us to live that value of wanting to be out in the world and not being afraid to put my 3-year-old in a French camp in a city I've never visited before, and just trusting that she had a little language and she was going to find her way. And so for me, that's, in the family structure, just a way of sort of paying forward that skill. And again, that gift that I received from my parents, even though they were not multilingual people. And then in the next slide, just selfishly, for those of us who've had the opportunity to live abroad and are trying to find ways to make that work once you have a family and a job and a mortgage, and you can't just move abroad so easily for a year, has also been to really keep in touch with all the wonderful friends that I made over my years abroad. So this is a picture from last summer in the Aveyron, and I'm with my friend Maya, whom I met in 1996, the year I lived in northern France as a teaching assistant. She was a German teacher at that high school. And our kids are now friends, and we Skype regularly. We go on vacations together in the summer, and just having that capacity to use our language to build friendship around the world has meant so much. So I don't think years ago I would have understood that necessarily as a form of advocacy, but it has become clear to me that if you really believe in a multilingual society, then it has to start at home. And even if that's not your first language, it's not impossible to raise your own children in another language. And it's actually a lot of fun, and it makes some of the really mundane, repetitive aspects of parenting a little more interesting. So when you're home with a baby and you're having to look up, oh, how do you say, give me a good burp? Or what's the word for a wipe in French? To me, that was a way of making maternity leave less monotonous and boring, and adding that linguistic piece that means so much to me.
And a lot may say that right now in COVID-19, that is also an opportunity to keep things less mundane, or to add some spice to that, just like that, to infuse some of those language pieces when they're spending more time at home.
Yeah. And I'll just say that when I'm wandering around our community, which has lots and lots of multilingual families from all over the world, we get nothing but praise for speaking French. So if I go to the grocery store and people overhear me speaking French to the kids, they will not hesitate to come up to me. Oh, you're speaking French to them. That's so wonderful. They hear I have an accent. Are you from Quebec? Is your husband French? Do they understand you? Like, people want to, and so it sort of is a conversation starter. But it also made me realize over time that this is such a privilege that with my white skin and speaking French, which is a language that's generally recognized and not feared in the United States, I was only complimented for this. And at the same time that I'm having that experience in the Boston suburbs, there are brown and Black people who are speaking Spanish and Arabic and who are being physically attacked for speaking a language other than English here in the United States. And that is totally unacceptable to me. And I think I have an obligation as a language teacher, as a speaker of another language, as someone with white skin privilege, to really think about how can I work in this world as an advocate for all people who are speaking any language in the United States. And I didn't make that connection initially as we sort of made our way around the neighborhood and got all these compliments. But I think the news stories of the last couple of years really make it clear that we are living in a hostile environment for people who do not speak English, particularly people with brown and Black skin. And so thinking about, what are the ways that we stand up for multilingual people in our communities? And what are the ways that we can use our language skills to connect with a variety of communities around that language? So if you want to go to the next slide, this is a picture of me at a wedding of an amazing asylum seeker and, until this moment, single parent of a young daughter who came to the United States from Cameroon. And she had been a math teacher back in Cameroon. And when she arrived in the area, in the Boston area, she was living in our town, and there was a multi-faith organization that was working to welcome asylum-seeking and refugee families. And so, because she spoke French, among other languages, folks asked me if I'd be willing to step in and do some English tutoring. And I really have only taught English in France, so that is something that's a little bit familiar to me. And I was in the process of preparing for an important French exam that I needed to pass. So it was also really great for me to have that conversation practice. And through getting to know Ines, she began by just giving me math lessons in English, because that was what was most familiar and comfortable to her. And I'm a terrible math student, so she was able to start nearly at the beginning as we worked through it. I really was able to get a different lens on some of the rhetoric that we're hearing in the United States around African countries and around immigrants. And so it was just very powerful to check, I'd be going to her house once a week, twice a week for an hour or two, and just see how she was navigating the never-ending changes to immigration policy, the uncertainty around being able to find employment and medical care, childcare for her daughter. And I'm happy to say that after a year and a half in that apartment sponsored by our organization, she was able to move out on her own, find employment, but it's crazy employment. She has like 2 jobs. She's working day and night, so the childcare is really tough. And then she met this wonderful man and was married in a ceremony this past fall. So, just being part of someone's journey here in the United States through initially a language learning connection really made me think about, not just being an advocate for people to know languages, but how are we advocates for people who are here in the United States and who are trying to figure out English and making a life for themselves here?
And I think that's kind of a perfect segue to kind of connecting to our audience. Some questions have started to come in about some pedagogy related things, which I'll get to in just a moment. But, thinking about our young alumni with AFS who've had these, amazing transformational experiences abroad, and they're bringing that rich language back to the United States along with their cultural understanding and their reflections about how they've grown in their own self-awareness and so on. What recommendations would you put out there for them on how they can use their language skills and their cultural knowledge to join this kind of force, if you will, of language advocacy around our country at a time when it's very much needed?
So there's a lot of different paths, and I think the best path is going to be the one that speaks to you and that you're going to feel motivated by. Being able to work with someone who's a newcomer to the United States is just an amazing opportunity. And for me, after the 2016 elections, it was really one of the few things that I felt I legitimately looked forward to each week. And so if you have that opportunity, I would definitely encourage you to look into your town's ESL program, often run through public libraries, that sort of thing. At the same time, obviously, we're in an economic crisis right now in the United States, and world language programs in public schools are really suffering. And the budget considerations in education departments as schools try to prepare for the reopening of school in the fall puts our programs in jeopardy. And so I live in a town where we really made every sacrifice to buy a very small apartment so we could be in this town because the education is so good. And they pink slipped every K-8 world language teacher at the end of May in this town. And so I was very involved in advocacy efforts to talk to town administrators, school committee members about why it's so important that we start language learning from a very early age. And those teachers were recalled and have positions for next year, but it was not automatic that that was going to happen by any stretch of the imagination. And I think a lot of the decision makers in our governments are of the generation that did not receive a world-class world language education. And they really need to hear that what's going on in classrooms today is not like what they experienced. And that not only are the kids in most cases being taught to really use the language, but they are getting this cultural perspective piece and learning about how to communicate in a way that is unique to this discipline and essential for 21st century life. And so for those of you who have personal stories that you can tell, always, I think stories are what make people change their minds, is really thinking about, what's your language learning story been, and how could you share that with your community through a letter to the editor, an interview with the local paper, reaching out to teachers in your area and seeing what the situation is budgetarily and what kind of community support they need. You might be able to make a big difference. And I think what happened, if it can happen in the town where I live, it can happen anywhere. And it is happening in many places across Massachusetts and in the Northeast from stories I've heard. So thinking about how can you be an advocate for those programs? And then given the distance learning situation that we've been in and that we may be in again when schools reopen, students need a lot of support. And the way remote learning has rolled out has had pretty poor results, even for our strongest students. It's really tough for kids. And so I think if you have a language skill that you're able to share through any sort of online tutoring, coaching, conversation, kids really crave that human contact. And teachers, given all the limitations on their time and the structures of remote learning, can't give as much individual person-to-person support as we would like to. So I think that's another opportunity where people could really volunteer with local world language departments, community education programs to provide a really valuable service to young people.
Well, and you've taken us straight to some of the questions that are starting to come in on the chat box. So it's a wonderful transition time. Because we did have a question come in about, knowing that you, just like every other teacher across the country, language or non-language, had to make that transition to that quick pivot from in-person instruction to, this world of remote and virtual learning and instruction. What are some of the things or the ideas or activities, tasks that you found to be the most impactful for your students, where they were able to connect the most with you or with the language?
Sure. So I was not in Massachusetts when schools closed here. I was away at a conference in Minnesota. And so I didn't get a chance to say goodbye to my students or to take anything with me out of the classroom. And so it was a very disorienting period trying to just find my students again who had gone missing in the ether and trying to reconnect with them. And I think initially my focus was really on trying to reproduce the classroom structure as much as I could for my students. And so I wanted all the slides to look familiar. I wanted to follow our same routines. I wanted to have the same order of events that we would have had in a live in-person class when we were online with our Zoom classes together. And after a couple of weeks, I realized, kids have really different levels of comfort, and they were in all kinds of different situations in terms of their own personal well-being when they were at home, and as they mostly still are. And so I really actually needed to start teaching in a different way, where I was getting a better sense of whether or not the students were engaged during the lessons. And so I had this after I realized that there were some classes I was teaching where a couple of kids had their cameras off, and when I would call their names, no answer. Not really clear if the kids were there at all. And that was a wake-up call to me. And so I started using some different online tools. There's a Google add-on called Nearpod that lets you take a slideshow, share it with your students in such a way, kind of like we did with the poll earlier today, where I can ask a question and I can get answers back in real time. I can share them, I can spotlight one answer, I can make it anonymous and share it to the group. And that got a lot more engagement from a much broader range of students, because there were those 5 kids who were gonna raise their hands. It didn't matter to them if we were in person, if we were on Zoom, they were just like, go, go, go. And then there were another 20 kids in the class who were really kind of sitting back and not comfortable speaking in front of the Zoom audience. And so I found that having more back channels for communication was much more important in that setting, and that I was able to get a much higher degree of engagement from my students. I also found that for any child with any sort of executive functioning issue, and this happens in my house as a parent as well as a teacher, the kids were like being sent to so many different sites and, watch this video on this site and then do a reading here. It just, like you would look at the list of assignments online and it was total chaos. And so our department as a middle school world language department made a concerted effort to really systemize how we pushed out the asynchronous work and how it came back to us. And so we gave each student an editable slideshow on Monday. Everything was embedded in that. Everything went back into that slideshow, and then they would turn them in on Friday. And we just felt like, for the kids to have one go-to spot online was really important. And I think the kids just craved personal connections. And so I had a lot of optional office hour slots for small groups in the afternoon where you could just sign up for a 15-minute slot. And after advertising it to the kids and getting the usual hand-raising suspects who signed up, I also advertised it to the parents and guidance counselors of students who I hadn't seen a lot of and was worried about. And I got a whole nother group of kids signed up then. Kids could sign up with friends, and it just became a place to come and have like a 10, 15-minute conversation with Madame. The sixth graders enjoyed playing silly competitive games with one another during that time. And just to kind of recreate some of that smile, that spontaneous laughter that we would experience in the classroom. So, I had no training in online learning before. I just started on March 23rd, like, many other teachers, and I am definitely still learning. I have a lot I want to get on top of this summer so that I can go into the fall kind of ready for anything. But those were some of my initial takes.
Great. Thank you for sharing that, because I think a lot of the educators on our call were thrown into a very similar situation and probably experienced a lot of the same things. There are those typical students who, whether they're in class or on Zoom, are going to be the first to raise their hands, and others who are more reluctant. So here's our next question that comes from an individual on the webinar, saying, as a French teacher for middle school students, can you share your experience or observation regarding access to French language instruction tools like music, film, short stories, and other media that come from Francophone countries that are not France? So Senegal, the Congo, Cameroon, etc.
Sure. So I basically didn't teach with a curriculum for the first 15 years of my career. I just taught with the textbook, and whatever was in the book was what I taught. And some of it was real garbage. And there was a whole lesson on Haiti where I had to spend like an entire day in English having the kids pull out all the stereotypes about Haitian people that were in the page before we could even get to anything about Haitian culture. So it was like a lot of work for little yield in some cases. And as I began to learn about thematic curriculum design, I wrote these thematic units where the topic was based on whatever the textbook chapter had been about. So we still had a unit that focused on housing, and we still had a unit that focused on free time, but we tried to go with a much deeper theme that had some sort of a social justice piece to it. So if we were talking about clothing, we would also look at who makes our clothes and under what conditions. Or if we're talking about food, we could think about who's hungry in our world and what are some organizations in the French-speaking world that are working to fight hunger. And so that kind of opened up, once I was out of the textbook, I needed to find all these what we call authentic resources. So things made by and for native speakers. And initially, I think very much my lens was France, France, France. And with the way the internet works now, there's absolutely no reason that needed to be the case. And there were so many amazing outlets where, for example, as part of our clothing unit, we can do a whole piece on les sapeurs in Congo, and these men who dress as dandies as part of their fight against colonialism and their search for peace in their country. And so a lot of those resources are things I found online. Like once I had my thematic unit frame in mind, I kind of had boxes in my brain. And as I was scrolling through Twitter and I would see a song from Quebec about this, or I would see an infographic about tiny houses, or a Swiss protest about sweatshop conditions, those were all pieces that I could sort of file away that became nuggets to grow the units. So there really is a lot out there from French-speaking countries around the world. And I think for me, what I'm still working on is trying to make sure that it's not every country for every unit. I think I know I failed when at the end of the unit, a kid says to me, which place was it where they were eating with their hands? And you're like, okay, that was not what I was hoping to get. So I tend to do for each unit one French-speaking location where that's the focus. And so the kids know if we're talking about clothing, we're talking about the sapeur, we're talking about Congo, and that's a chance to look at a little bit of the geography, some cultural productions by and for Congolese people about the sapeur, and then the kids doing some cultural perspectives. Like this past year, my students were very interested in Visco girls. So we talked about, what are the values that you see in Visco girls? What's the music? What's the look? And how does that compare to the values of the sapeur? What's the look? What's the music? And so I'm just always sort of shopping for more resources. I'm fortunate in Boston, we do have this amazing French library. So I can go there and just physically look through books and see what I can find on a topic, which has been a great help. The AATF, the Association of Teachers of French in the United States, does an amazing job curating a lot of that. So it doesn't need to be a one-woman search for the perfect resource. There's a lot that's sort of out there. And I think the kids are really curious. I think if you asked my students, why'd you sign up for French? They're thinking Eiffel Tower, poodles, cafe au lait. And then when they get into the class and they're like, oh my gosh, it's a global language. Okay, we're talking 5 continents. We're going to be looking at stuff going on in Southeast Asia. We're going to be looking at North Africa. We're going to look at West Africa. We're going to be looking at the Caribbean. There's so many more connections. And a lot of my students are taking the language because in some way it connects to their family's history. So in Boston, we have a large Haitian community, and every year, I have a couple kids of Haitian descent who are hearing French at home and whose parents may have been educated in French back in Haiti. So it just opens up a lot more possibilities.
Yeah, and I love your piece about, creating all of this, not only to focus on proficiency, but also to, make sure you're thinking about this thematic unit idea. And so to that end, one of the things we did as AFS to help educators, especially during this remote instruction, that quick pivot is, and we've recorded them, so they're now available on our website, but we have, because we're part of an international network, we were able to work with our partners from some of the other countries, like Tunisia, for example, in French, and they did some presentations for us where there was a highlight in each one, but they share about, school and family life. They share about the global challenges that they're experiencing. And especially our one in Tunisia, we actually had a local Tunisian, young woman who took us on a tour of her home and showed us the food and the dress and, the dancing that were all part of their Ramadan celebration as a family. And so to look at the lens of a Muslim culture through the Francophone, through French, through the French-speaking world, and be able to share this 5 or 10 minute clip with your students, if that is something that is a theme of one of your units. These are resources that we are building with as AFS for teachers to have in the target language, and they're authentic because they have been created by French speakers, by Spanish speakers, even by Portuguese speakers, and are made available for educators to use in their classrooms. We have them in English as well for social studies teachers or science teachers who are teaching about global challenges around the world and so on, which kind of helps me bridge to the next question that I see here about what role do you think language instructors can play in bringing brown and black cultures to predominantly white US classrooms? And I think the slide that's right here being shown about your, your speech and everything when you accepted your Language Teacher of the Year title almost plays into that at the same time when we think about privilege and we think about, different compositions of different classrooms and places around the United States. So, what role do you think language teachers can play in helping bring those brown and black cultures to our white classrooms?
Yeah, I feel like we're in an amazing moment as world language teachers to really have a role to play. And I would admit that early in my teaching career, I sort of thought that all current events belonged to the social studies teachers, and that they were the only ones who needed to sort of address what was ever going on. And I really credit my school system with letting educators know everybody is part of this project. And if we're going to be saying Black Lives Matter in our school, then there needs to be a math equipped part of Black Lives Matter, and there needs to be a world language part. And so, you know, for me, I think one of the parts that's been important, and I teach in a majority white school, and I've definitely heard teachers make the argument, oh, I don't really have Black students, so I'm not sure that this would be important to my culture. And I would say, you know, on the contrary, all the more important. You know, our students need to be exposed to people of different backgrounds. And if, unfortunately, that's not something that they're experiencing in the classroom every day, then it needs to be extra present in the curriculum. And so I took a course on anti-racism for teachers years and years ago, where they had us do an inventory just of our physical classroom, and even thinking about what are the images that you're using to promote your language. So again, if the French classroom just looks like Eiffel Towers and poodles and white ladies in berets walking their dogs, you know, that conveys a very particular message about who the class is for and who the class is about. And so I really took that to heart at the time, and spent a lot of time just even thinking about the decorations in my classroom, not to make it neutral, but to make sure that there were faces, brown and Black faces in the classroom, so that every student would see themselves mirrored, but that, you know, we talk about this, you know, not only a mirror, that I am present in the classroom, and even if I'm stuck with a white female teacher, as so many Black and brown students are in the United States these days, that my teacher is making an effort to provide mirrors for me. But then also that that's a window, right? So for students who are used to looking at other white faces in the classroom, that classroom becomes a place where you have a window into these other experiences. And it can be really challenging and uncomfortable. There's an amazing short film called Binta and the Great Idea that a colleague of mine recommended to me. And it's an awesome film. If you're looking for something to watch, it's free online, and it's available in French, it's available in English. And the storyline is from the perspective of a Senegalese girl. And you sort of don't know what's going on throughout the whole film. But at the end, she talks about wanting to adopt a Tubab child, a white child, so that they can show this child all the important, deep things that are going on in Senegalese culture. And having shown this film to my students, the white students had a very hard time understanding that though it was not the white child who was going to be teaching all the Senegalese people about all the important Western things that they were missing out on. Like the kids, it just was this crazy, crazy hard shift for them to try to put the African experience front and center. And I didn't necessarily feel equipped to do it well. So we were just sort of muddling through it. Oh, why do you think that? Oh, how do you know that that's true? Tell me more about what you mean when you say that's normal. Why do you think that's important? Is it important to everybody? Is it important just to you? But sort of being that question asker and trying to put the kids in front of a lot of material that is not centering their experience. I mean, I just think that's like one of the best things we can offer. And being able to do that in a way that's level appropriate, maturity appropriate, linguistically possible in the language, like that's the whole dance of our craft. But I do think that it builds amazing connections with students of color who are seeing themselves in the curriculum, and then sometimes start to want to share about, oh, you know, my family in Cameroon, this is how we do it, or this is what my mom told me about when her grandparents, blah, blah, gives them a place of expertise to share. But it's challenging. It's challenging work for sure.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you for that. And that's, you know, one of the things I love about a lot of the lesson plans that we've been able to share with AFS is that we help teachers have some of those discussion questions, you know, that they may not know exactly what to ask when they have an authentic resource or when they have one of these impromptu situations or discussions that come up. There are questions that will help prompt and guide the students to think and process and reflect on the information that was just presented to them. So thank you for going right there. Now we are in our period right here to kind of wrap things up a little bit. So I think we're at, you know, kind of our final question, which will really help bring it home, I think, for everybody who's joining us on the webinar. So our educators, our young alumni, and our volunteers, one and the same here. to think about, what, with all that's, going on with education, with everything you've mentioned about, your focus on proficiency and making sure that students have a usable aspect of language to go out to the world, and that they have those cultural components that are directly tied to the individuals that they're going to interact with in the language. What are some ideas or some things that, these volunteers or that the young alumni could do to engage with classrooms? And conversely, what can teachers utilize with AFS to access, the resources here or our alumni network? What are some ways to put those two pieces together that you've seen or that you think would be very beneficial in your classroom moving forward?
Sure. So I think one of the few upsides to a pandemic is most people are at home and have some time on their hands. And just as a parent of younger children, I can't say how much it has meant for me to be able to put them in contact with older adults who do not live in our house, who are able to provide really any semblance of entertainment at all, is just an enormous, enormous gift. So thinking about, and I say that as like literally right now, my old boss, my department head, is playing chess online with my son in the other room, and I just cannot thank him enough for doing that. So any sort of Zoom tutoring, kids did not get a great education in the spring in the United States. Like pretty much every child could use a little more conversational language, a little more practice, a partner to watch a film with, someone to, anything that you could offer on that. Parents are desperately looking to occupy their children. There's an article about parent burnout in the New York Times last week that speaks deeply to my predicament. So I think, every camp has fallen apart. Is there a way to be doing something camp-like online? Maybe, having some sort of reunion with some of the other people you were abroad with and putting something together as a group would be amazing. And then, teachers, because of how weird our teaching schedules may be in the fall, may have a lot more availability to sort of welcome guests. Like, right, we don't have to do all the paperwork to have you come into the classroom, and we can just switch to you on the Zoom. So thinking about, if you have an existing presentation, is it something that you would want to maybe get feedback from some teachers on which level it would be appropriate for, or how that might tie into their curriculum? And teachers are definitely looking for resources and ways to connect kids that feel authentic in the absence of travel. And so, I think you have a tremendous resource there. And then I think for teachers like me and other teachers on this call to know that AFS has this pool of people who are not occupied with their normal set of tasks really is an opportunity for us, and one that I'm pretty excited about.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Rebecca. I know I've started seeing some thank yous come through here on the chat box, and everybody's very much appreciative of the fact that you were willing and able to give us some of your time and your expertise, and certainly your passion for language and experiences abroad and so on. And so we thank you tremendously for sharing with us today. For the alumni and for the volunteers who are on the call with us, I strongly encourage you to reach out if you have some time and some language skills or even some cultural stories that you're willing to share with educators in your area. As the individual at AFS-USA who works with our educator community, I would be happy to help start bridging some of you with some local educators to bridge that gap, so that teachers who are open to the AFS network and volunteers and young alumni who have those stories to share, I'd love to be able to put you in contact. And the same on the other side of that, for any educators who are on the call, if you're not already connected with us as an AFS educator, I encourage you to join. We've got the email address and the website right there on the screen for all of you. We'd love to be that bridge for all of you to have and serve kids better as we think about what the plans are for the fall. And those of you with language and culture stories have a tremendous resource that educators can and will need in the fall, as schedules look different and kids want connections with other humans. And I think in a lot of ways we are craving the same thing. So at a time when travel may not be as possible as it has been in the past, let's use the experiences that we've had as travelers and our homestay experiences to give that gift to the students across the US. So I will turn it over to Julie if there's anything that you want to share to wrap things up. But thank you, Rebecca, and thank you to all of our attendees today.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jill. Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you for everyone joining us today. I